He was 70 years old. Born in England, William came to America in 1851 with his young wife Anne. He owned a blacksmith shop and worked hard raising his family. He provided for them well, and he was proud of what they had become. William is buried at Mount Holly Cemetery, just a few miles from the Foxes' home. With their father gone, the lives of the Fox family begins to change. Mother Ann wanted Walter and Nellie to move into her house and live with her. She wanted the house filled with the pleasant noise of children once again. By the time of the funeral, Mary was 3 months pregnant. She told her mother-in-law Anne at the funeral. It was a little bit of joy for grief-stricken Anne. Walter and Nellie and their newborn son Thomas moved in with Mother Ann. Walter worked his father's 65 acres and helped his brother Sax. He kept the house he owned at the end of the horse path. It would be perfect for when his sons were ready to start their own families. In the meantime, he would rent the property out to tenant farmers. Sax and Mary lived across the street and could watch over it for him. When Father William died, Sax and Mary had 2 children living at home. George was 4 and Nellie was 14 months. Her firstborn, a daughter named Essie, had died 5 years earlier. Now, Mary was pregnant with her 4th child. It was the spring planting season of 1888. For this year, Sax had ambitious plans. In addition to his farm that he worked with Walter, he was also planting the 80 acres that Mary's father gave them as a wedding gift. His new farm was 70 miles away in Ford County. The deed was in Mary's name. The lot north of his was being held for Ella Trigger, Mary's twin sister. Her father was waiting for Ella to be married. She had no current prospects. The lot south of his was owned by William Trigger, Mary's brother and Sax's brother-in-law. William had married 3 years earlier and built a home there. He and his wife Emma Jane had no children. Sax stayed at William's house while he worked his farm. His horse and plow were stored in William's barn. To get there, Sax took the railroad from Peoria to Gibson City. It was a one-day trip. He would make the trip in the spring to plant and in the fall to harvest. William would meet him at the train station. They would pick up supplies and then head home. Mary told Sax to get a haircut while he was in town. On the way they stopped at this hardware store for supplies. As William waited for the funeral to pass, Sax went to get his hair cut. As he waited, he talked with the men in the barber shop. The main topic of discussion was, of course, the cost of farmland. In Illinois, prices were rising steadily, but in Kansas, things were different. The railroad companies were beginning to sell off the land they were granted by the federal government. Millions of acres were available, and it was selling at very cheap prices. Sax thought it was a good opportunity. William and Sax traveled this road to get to William's house. He lived about 5 miles northeast of town. Sax noticed the candy store as they were leaving town. Within a couple of hours, they arrived here at Sax's farm. He would plow and plant this field each spring. It took several days. In the North 40, there was a small creek that separated his farm from Ella's property. It was Mary's favorite spot, and Sax wanted to build a new home there. Across the creek, Ella's property was uncultivated. What a waste, Sax thought. On his way home, Sax always stopped by the candy store in town. He filled a small bag with peppermints and gumdrops for each of the kids at home. George was 4, Nellie was 1. He called them goodie bags, and the children loved them. In early summer, Sax was back home with the kids and his pregnant wife, Mary. He was tired from his trip, but there was much to talk to Mary about. That night at dinner, Sax told Mary about his idea to invest in Kansas farmland. He and his brother Walter had the money, and it would be perfect for Sam and Katie. Sam was living on his father's property. He had no land of his own. Sachs also told Mary he thought it was a shame that her sister Ella's 80 acres goes untended year after year. Mary told Sachs she thought it was a shame that a girl as pretty as Ella goes unmarried year after year. Mary tried to help Ella find someone, but most of the local boys they knew were already married. The others did not appeal to Ella. Mary would need help from her sister-in-law, Katie. Katie was at Mary's house almost every day. It was mid-July, and Mary was 8 months pregnant. During her visits, Katie would stop at the Trigger's house and pick up Ella. It was on the way to Mary's house. She made the trip a countless number of times over the past 8 years. Soon the girls had a plan. They would host a big dinner for friends and family. This will give the boys an opportunity to talk about their venture in Kansas. Walter and Nellie would come. Walter and Sachs were business partners. Mary would invite her twin sister Ella. And of course, Katie and Sam would come, and Sam would bring his friend, John Secretan. John Secretan was a neighbor of the Chambers family. They lived in Kickapoo, just a few miles from Sam and Katie. John was a successful businessman and single. He accepted the invitation. The girls worked hard and dinner went well. They would soon become experts at hosting social events. Katie and Mary made sure that Ella and John spent time together and would get to know each other. It worked. Within a year, Ella Trigger and John Secretan were engaged to be married. Later that summer, in August of 1888, Sachs and Mary had their 4th child. As usual, the entire family was there, including Walter and Nellie. Mother and child were doing fine. Within a few hours, Mary and Sachs asked to see Walter. They told Walter the baby was healthy and needed a name. With his blessing, they would like to name their new son Walter, after his uncle. Walter was honored. Big Walter and Little Walter would grow up to be very close to each other. Sachs and Walter brought in the fall harvest the next year. Sam Chambers brought in his crop with his father. It would be the last year he worked with his dad. They sold their crops at the Peoria Mercantile and headed to the railroad land office. There, they purchased 160 acres of Kansas farmland. The deed was similar to this one and was in Sam Chambers' name. The plan was that Sam and Katie would move there, and Sam would work the farm. Sachs and Walter would help him with the payments until he was self-supporting. After a few years, they would sell the improved farmland and house and split the profits. Katie did not especially like the plan. She did not want to move away from her family. But it was the best for Sam, and she agreed to go. They would be leaving before the next spring planting season. It was the winter of 1889. As Katie was preparing for her move to Kansas, her sister-in-law was having a baby. In February, Walter and Nellie had a healthy son. They named him Norvin Saxelby, after his Uncle Sachs, Walter's little brother. It was a gesture of mutual respect. A year earlier, Sachs named his newborn son Walter. Norvin was a spitting image of Sachs, and their 2 lives would be almost identical. The year was 1890. All of the Fox family was at home when Nellie gave birth to Norvin. Katie was there, of course. She came to help with the baby, but she also wanted to see her mother, Anne. Anne had not been well, and she was getting no better. As Katie sat with her sick mother, she made an important decision. She gathered the men together and said she was not going to Kansas until Mother was better. The farming venture would be put on hold. Katie had a husband and 2 little girls at home, but she visited her mother almost every day. All through that summer, Anne's condition worsened. On August 16, 1890, our great-great-grandmother, Anne Rooston Fox, died at her home. She was 67 years old. Anne is buried next to William, her beloved husband of 42 years. They are together at the Mount Holly Cemetery in Peoria, Illinois. All of the Fox children were deeply saddened with their mother's passing, but Walter seemed to take it the hardest. He loved his mother. Within a year, Walter's wife Nellie was pregnant with their third child. If it was a daughter, he promised, she would be named Anne Rooston Fox. It was. For Katie, it was the worst day ever. She lost her mother, and soon she would be leaving friends and family behind when she moves to Kansas.